I'm so glad you're here. My name is Ashley, and I'm a 71-year-old mother who always believed in giving my only son the world. If you're watching this video, please like and subscribe, because I want you to hear my story of revenge. For 3 years, I paid my son and his wife's rent, bought their furniture, and filled their fridge, thinking I was a special part of their lives. But when I called to ask about their wedding, my daughter-in-law told me with a chilling smile, "Oh, we already got married. We only invited special people." They thought I was just a weak-old woman they could use for money. They had no idea their bank account was about to be closed for good. I want to know how far my story has reached, so please tell me in the comments where you're listening from. The first chill of November always brought him back to me, not as a ghost, but as a warmth on my wrist where his Rolex rested. It was a Tuesday morning, the kind David had loved, with pale sunlight filtering through the kitchen window of my Princeton home, turning the dust motes into a slow, glittering dance. I ran my thumb over the watch's cool, stainless steel, a habit I'd formed over the 5 years since his passing. Its weight was comforting, a solid piece of him in a world that felt increasingly fragile. My gaze drifted across the quiet living room to his old office, the door shut as it always was. Inside, his locked file cabinet stood like a silent monument, a testament to a part of his life I had never pried into. We had chosen this life, a simple one, built on the belief that true wealth was peace, not possessions. My cozy, well-kept home was more than enough. The scent of fresh coffee mingled with the faint, pleasant smell of old books from the living room shelves. I watered my African violets, their purple blooms a small, daily joy, and prepared for another quiet day. The ringing of the phone was a sharp intrusion. I dried my hands on my apron and answered, a smile in my voice. "Hey, Mom. How are you?" Christopher's voice was strained, the easy warmth it once held now replaced by a persistent tension that had been growing for months. "I'm well, sweetheart. Just enjoying the morning. How are things with you? Is Jessica okay?" There was a pause. I could picture him running a hand through his hair, a nervous habit he'd had since he was a boy. Yeah, everyone's fine. Listen, Mom, I hate to ask." He trailed off. "Things are a little tight this month. A client paid late, and we have a bit of a cash flow problem. I was wondering if you could maybe help us out with a small loan." My heart did its familiar little ache. It wasn't the request that bothered me, but the stress I heard in my son's voice. "Of course, honey. Don't you worry. How much do you need?" "Just a few hundred. 500 maybe? Just to tide us over." Before I could answer, another voice cut in from the background, sharp and impatient. It was Jessica. "Just ask her for the full amount, Chris. Stop beating around the bush." The words were muffled but clear, a splash of ice water on my maternal warmth. Christopher quickly spoke over her. "It's nothing, Mom. She's just stressed. Don't worry. 500 would be a huge help." "All right, sweetheart," I said, my own voice a little tighter than before. "I'll transfer it this morning. I love you." "Love you too, Mom. You're a lifesaver. Bye." The line went dead. I stood there, receiver in hand, the sound of Jessica's demanding voice echoing in my ears. It hadn't been a request for help. It had been an expectation. I slowly placed the phone back in its cradle. The peace of the morning shattered. My eyes fell on the wall calendar, the date neatly circled 2 weeks from now, November 27th. Thanksgiving. I had been looking forward to it, hoping for a day of warmth and easy laughter, a chance to feel like a family again, but a knot of unease was tightening in my stomach. As I hung up the phone, a thought, cold and unwelcome, crept into my mind. This wasn't about a cash flow problem. This was about something much bigger. Thanksgiving Day, November 27th, arrived not with the scent of roasting turkey, but with the cloying perfume of Jessica's ambition. I had spent the past 2 weeks trying to push our last phone call from my mind, convincing myself that I was imagining the tension. The house was filled with the comforting smells of a holiday meal: roasting turkey, sage, and warm pumpkin pie, a desperate attempt to build a fortress of warmth against the chill I felt in my heart. They arrived precisely at 2 in the afternoon. Christopher gave me a brief, tight hug, his eyes darting everywhere but at my face before settling on the football game playing quietly on the television. Jessica, however, swept in with a dazzling smile, handing me a bottle of wine that was surely expensive. "Mom, the house smells divine. You always make Thanksgiving so special." "This old house has such good bones," she commented as she walked into the living room, her gaze sweeping over the crown molding and the hardwood floors, not with nostalgia, but with the cold calculation of a real estate appraiser. It reminded me of her first visit years ago, when her first question after hello had been about the annual property taxes. I tried to push the thought away to be the perfect hostess. The afternoon was a master class in passive aggression, with me feeling increasingly on edge. Christopher sank into an armchair, his attention fixed on the screen, a shield against the conversation to come. He drank his wine too quickly, his knuckles white around the stem of the glass. "Oh, this stuffing is so traditional," Jessica remarked, pushing the breadcrumbs around her plate as we nibbled on appetizers. "My mother uses a gluten-free quinoa base now, so much healthier for you." I smiled tightly, offering her a cracker. "I'm glad you both could make it." She ignored my attempt at warmth and pivoted. "You know, the market in this neighborhood is just unbelievable right now," she said to no one in particular. "The Morrisons down the street, they sold their colonial for almost double what they paid. It's a real windfall. So smart of them to cash out while they can." I tried to change the subject, asking about Christopher's work, but Jessica was relentless. She turned to my son, who was now fidgeting with his collar, his discomfort a palpable thing in the room. "Didn't you want to talk to your mom about that loan, honey? The one for the down payment? Before all the good houses are gone?" Christopher flinched, his eyes still glued to the screen. "Jess, maybe not now." "What down payment?" I asked, though I already dreaded the answer. Jessica ignored Christopher's panic, her voice as smooth as silk as she turned her bright, predatory smile on me directly. "Actually, Ashley, we were thinking bigger than a loan. We were thinking of an investment in our future." She placed her hand over Christopher's, a gesture of ownership. "An investment that would benefit all of us in the long run." There are moments that cleave a life in two, a before and an after. For me, that moment sounded like the scrape of a chair and the cold click of a Rolex clasp being undone. Jessica's words, "an investment that would benefit all of us," hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. The festive smells of cinnamon and roasted turkey turned sour in my throat. I placed my fork down on my plate, the small clink echoing in the sudden silence. The carved turkey sat on the platter, its steam rising into the tense air. No one was eating. I looked at my son, Christopher, who refused to meet my gaze, his focus still stubbornly fixed on the muted football game. "This house is not an investment, Jessica," I said, my voice gentle but firm. "It's my home. Your father and I built it. Every memory we have as a family lives within these walls. It is not for sale." The mask of civility on Jessica's face shattered. "For crying out loud, Ashley, it's a decaying asset," she snapped, her voice low and sharp. The pretense of a happy family dinner vanished, replaced by a raw, ugly greed. She leaned toward Christopher, her whisper a venomous hiss. "Do it. Do what we talked about." Christopher went pale. He looked from his wife's hard, expectant face to mine. I saw a flicker of the boy I raised in his eyes, a flash of shame and conflict, but it was extinguished as quickly as it appeared. He pushed his chair back, the legs scraping harshly against the hardwood floor. He walked around the table and stood before me. His face was a mess of shame and desperation. "Mom," he began, his voice strained, "if you won't help us, then I'm taking this." Before I could process his words, his hand shot out and clamped around my left wrist. His fingers were cold and strong. With his other hand, he fumbled with the clasp of David's Rolex. I flinched, not from pain, but from the sheer shock of his touch. So alien and aggressive. "Christopher, don't," I whispered. The clasp clicked open. He ripped the watch from my arm, the metal link scratching my skin. He held it up, dangling it between his fingers as if it were a prize he had won. "It's what Dad would have wanted," he said, his voice hard and unfamiliar. But I remembered what David had actually said when he gave me the watch, his eyes full of love on our 30th anniversary. "This is for you, Ash. It counted my time. Now it will count ours." Christopher's face was a twisted mask of desperation and resentment. He would have wanted me, his son, to have this. He took a step back, the watch now clutched in his fist. "You're just an old woman," he spat, the words landing like a physical blow. "You don't deserve it." I didn't say a word. I didn't cry. I simply looked at the empty space on my wrist, then at the face of the man who had been my son. He was a stranger to me now. I stood up from the table, walked past him as if he were invisible, and closed my bedroom door. In the silence that followed, I knew something inside me had broken for good. The silence in the house the next morning was heavier than 1,000 accusations. I hadn't slept, not really. I'd spent the 5 hours until dawn staring at the patterns the streetlights made on my ceiling, my mind replaying that single brutal moment on a loop. When I finally came downstairs on this cold Friday, November 28th, the scene was a monument to last night's disaster. The magnificent turkey, barely touched, sat cold and congealed on its platter. Wine glasses, some half full, were scattered across the stained linen tablecloth. Plates of food were left abandoned, a feast turned to ruin. My wrist felt unnervingly light, a constant physical reminder of the void Christopher had left. I looked at the untouched pumpkin pie on the counter, its perfect crust and whipped cream topping a sweet offering for a bitter memory. For a moment, a wave of grief so profound washed over me that my knees felt weak. I had lost my son. The boy I had raised, the man I had loved, was gone, replaced by the cold stranger from last night. There was no point in wallowing. David had never been one for wallowing, so I moved with a mechanical numbness, gathering the plates, scraping food into the trash, running hot, soapy water in the sink. The silence was absolute, broken only by the clink of silverware and the rush of the faucet. Each dish I washed was a small act of defiance against the chaos, a way to impose order on a world that had spun off its axis. I was rinsing the last of the wine glasses when my phone, lying on the counter, buzzed. A flicker of something foolish, hope, perhaps, fluttered in my chest. Maybe it was an apology. Maybe he'd woken up this morning and realized the monstrous thing he had done. I dried my hands and picked up the phone. It was a text from Christopher. My thumb trembled as I opened it. "Mom, you overreacted last night. Jessica was just trying to help. We can talk when you're ready to be reasonable." I read the words once, then twice. The letters seemed to blur, then sharpen with a cruel, painful clarity. Overreacted. Reasonable. He wasn't sorry. He was annoyed. He wasn't begging for forgiveness. He was demanding my compliance. The text was a splash of icy water, shocking the grief right out of me. The deep, aching sadness that had hollowed me out began to solidify, to morph into something else. It was a cold, clear anger. The tears that had been threatening all morning dried up instantly. My hands, which had been trembling, became perfectly still. He felt no guilt. He felt no remorse. He had stolen a piece of my husband's memory, a piece of my heart, and all he felt was inconvenienced by my sadness. That single, dismissive text was more damning than the act itself. It told me that the son I knew was truly gone, and there was nothing left to save. I deleted the message. "Reasonable," I whispered to the empty kitchen, the word tasting like poison. He has no idea what reasonable is about to look like. A week later, my doorbell rang, and standing on my porch was my son, my daughter-in-law, and a stranger in a suit who looked at my home like it was already sold. The silence of the past 7 days had been a cold, heavy blanket. I hadn't called, and neither had they. Now, on this chilly Saturday afternoon in early December, they had returned, and they had brought an accomplice. Christopher wouldn't meet my eyes. He stared at the worn welcome mat, the very picture of shame. Jessica, however, beamed as if this were a perfectly normal social call. "Ashley!" "We were in the neighborhood and thought we'd stop by," she chirped, gesturing to the man beside her. "This is Mr. Gable. He's a real estate agent. We just wanted to get a professional opinion on the house's value." Before I could form a response, she breezed past me into the foyer. "We took the liberty of getting an appraisal," Jessica said brightly, as if she were announcing she'd brought a pie. Mr. Gable followed her, looking deeply uncomfortable, his professional smile faltering as he caught my icy stare. "The kitchen could probably use a modern touch," Jessica's voice echoed from the next room. "And these windows are original, aren't they? Great for character, but not so much for energy efficiency." Each word was a calculated cut, designed to dismantle my home piece by piece in front of a stranger, to reduce it to a list of flaws and necessary upgrades. Christopher remained rooted on the porch, a silent, complicit statue. As the man walked through my house, my gaze fell on David's old leather wallet sitting on his desk, the one I hadn't touched in 5 years. I suddenly felt a desperate need to hold something of his that they couldn't taint. That was enough. My anger, which had been simmering for a week, finally reached a boiling point. I walked into the living room where Mr. Gable was making notes on a clipboard. "This tour is over," I said, my voice low but carrying an authority that made both him and Jessica freeze. I turned to the agent. "You are trespassing in my home without my permission. I suggest you leave." Mr. Gable's face flushed. I'm so sorry, Mrs. Hayes. I was given to understand." "You were misinformed," I cut him off. "Please leave my house, now." He didn't need to be told twice. He gathered his things with a mumbled apology and practically fled, sensing the raw hostility in the room. Jessica glared at me, her fake sweetness gone. "Well, that was incredibly rude," she hissed. "Get out," I said, pointing to the open door. "Both of you." She grabbed Christopher's arm and pulled him out, slamming the door behind them. The house fell silent again, but this time it was a violated silence. I stood there, shaking with a rage so profound it left me breathless. They had brought a stranger into my sanctuary, walked through my memories with muddy boots, and plotted to sell my life out from under me. Fighting back tears of fury, I walked to David's desk. I needed to feel close to him, to remember the man who had cherished this home, who had cherished me. I picked up his old wallet, the leather softened and worn from years of use. I opened it, expecting nothing but the faint scent of him and an old expired driver's license. But as my fingers traced the inside lining, I felt a hidden flap. Tucked inside, I found a tiny folded piece of paper. I unfolded it. On it was a small ornate brass key and a handwritten series of numbers. I stared at the small brass key. It didn't belong to any door in this house, but the numbers, they looked like a combination, and I knew exactly what they might unlock. The official-looking envelope that arrived on Monday didn't feel like paper. It felt like a declaration of war. I had spent the weekend in a state of suspended animation. The small brass key and the slip of paper with its string of numbers hidden safely in my jewelry box. I hadn't yet found the courage to see what they unlocked. The mail carrier's knock on Monday, December 8th, was sharp and insistent. He held out a clipboard for a certified letter, his expression neutral, unaware he was delivering a grenade to my quiet life. My hands trembled as I signed my name and took the crisp, heavy envelope. It felt cold to the touch. I closed the door and leaned against it, my heart hammering against my ribs. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, who this was from. In the kitchen, the silence of the house felt ominous. I sat at the table and slit the envelope open with a butter knife. The letterhead was embossed and elegant, bearing the name of a prestigious law firm I didn't recognize. Thompson, Gable, and Finch, with a line underneath that read, "Specialists in Elder Law and Estate Planning." The phrase hit me like a physical blow. Suddenly, I remembered the glossy brochures Jessica had left on my coffee table weeks ago, the ones for luxury senior living communities. I'd thrown them out, but I recalled the fine print at the bottom mentioning legal consultation services. This wasn't a recent idea. This was premeditated. My eyes scanned the carefully worded paragraphs. The letter didn't demand or threaten, not outright. It was worse. It was a snake coiled in polite legal jargon. It cordially invited me to a meeting with my son, Christopher, and his legal counsel to proactively discuss options for your long-term care and the responsible management of your assets. It spoke of ensuring my comfort and security in my later years. Then came the final venomous paragraph. It subtly implied that if I chose not to cooperate, they would be compelled to explore other legal avenues to ensure your well-being is protected under state law. I didn't need a dictionary to translate. Other legal avenues. Ensure your well-being. They were threatening to take me to court. They were threatening to have me declared incompetent. The veiled threat of a conservatorship hearing was no longer veiled. It was shining a blinding, ugly light on their entire plan. The fear was a cold, physical thing, a knot tightening in my stomach that made it hard to breathe. This was the full scope of their betrayal. My own son was willing to stand before a judge and argue that his mother, the woman who had raised him, was no longer capable of making her own decisions. The goal was to strip me of my home, my money, and my very autonomy. They wanted to erase me. But as I sat there in the ominous silence of my kitchen, the letter spread on the table like a death sentence. Something shifted. The fear didn't vanish, but it was joined by a surge of pure, undiluted anger. An old, forgotten strength began to stir within me, the same grit that had seen me through widowhood and loneliness. I was not a fragile old woman to be managed and disposed of. I was David Hayes's wife. I was Christopher's mother, and I was the owner of this house, this life, and whatever secrets that little brass key was waiting to unlock. I folded the letter, my fear slowly being replaced by an icy resolve. They wanted a legal fight, fine, but they were about to find out they weren't the only ones who could afford a lawyer. That evening, the doorbell rang again, but this time it wasn't a threat. It was Frank, my neighbor of 30 years, holding a casserole dish and wearing an expression of deep concern. His wife, Mary, had passed away 2 years ago, and we'd developed a quiet friendship, checking in on one another, sharing produce from our gardens. "I brought you some lasagna," he said, his kind eyes searching my face. "Figured you might not feel like cooking." The simple act of kindness was the one thing my carefully constructed composure couldn't withstand. The dam broke. A sob escaped my lips, and I quickly covered my mouth, mortified. "Ashley, let me in," he said gently. He stepped inside, placed the warm dish on the kitchen counter, and led me to the living room sofa. "I saw that certified letter get delivered, Ashley," he said, his voice low. "And I saw your son with that shark of a lawyer last week. I think we need to talk." And so I did. For the first time, I told someone everything. The words poured out of me in a torrent of pain and humiliation. The awful Thanksgiving dinner, the Rolex ripped from my wrist, the unannounced appraiser, and finally the cold, threatening letter that now lay on my coffee table. I finally cried, the hard knot of anger and fear dissolving into tears of sheer exhaustion. Frank listened patiently, his expression growing grimmer with every detail. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment, his jaw tight with anger on my behalf. "Ashley," he finally said, and the professional calm of his years as an accountant was in his voice. "You're not being paranoid, you're being targeted." He picked up the letter. This language, long-term care, management of assets, other legal avenues. They're trying to build a case for conservatorship. They'll paint you as confused and unable to manage your affairs so they can get a court to give them control of everything. Hearing him say it, confirming my worst fears, was paradoxically empowering. It wasn't a vague, nameless dread anymore. It was a strategy, a legal maneuver. It was a problem that could be fought. His validation was the first breath of fresh air I'd had in weeks. "But what can I do?" I asked, my voice trembling. "It's my word against my son's." "You need your own lawyer for one," he said firmly. "But first you need ammunition. You need every financial document David left behind, old tax returns, bank statements, deeds, insurance policies, everything. We need to show a long-term pattern of sound financial management." His practical advice cut through my panic. Financial papers, David's office. The thought sparked a memory, a flicker of something I'd found in the chaos of my anger and grief. The key, the numbers, the locked file cabinet. "Frank," I said, my voice barely a whisper as I stood up, "I think I might have found something." Together, we went into David's dusty office, a room I had kept as a sanctuary, a time capsule. The air was thick with the smell of old paper and the faint, lingering scent of my husband. I walked over to the old metal file cabinet. The one I'd always assumed held nothing but old warranties and tax records. I pulled the small brass key from my pocket. My hand shook as I inserted it into the lock. It turned with a soft click. The contents of that file box didn't just change my understanding of my husband, they changed the entire landscape of the war I was about to fight. With the soft click of the lock echoing in the dusty silence of David's office, a part of my old life ended, and a new one began. Frank stood beside me, a steady anchor as I lifted the heavy metal lid. The air that rose from the box smelled of aged paper and ink, the scent of a life's secrets carefully preserved. It wasn't filled with trinkets or old photographs. It was packed to the brim with thick, neatly organized folders. My trembling fingers reached for the first one. It was a property deed for a commercial building downtown I never knew we owned. The next held stock certificates for tech companies whose names I only recognized from the news. The one after that contained bank statements for an investment account with a balance that had 7 figures. "Good Lord, Ashley," Frank whispered, his voice thick with disbelief as he looked over my shoulder. David. He was playing a whole different game. My husband, the humble man who fixed our leaky faucet himself and insisted on driving a 10-year-old sedan, had been a brilliant secret investor. He was a multi-millionaire, and I, his wife, had no idea. On top of it all was a thick, sealed envelope. With numb fingers, I broke the seal. I lifted the top document, a notarized last will and testament dated 6 months before David's death. It began, "To my beloved wife, Ashley, to whom I entrust not only my heart, but the fruits of a lifetime of work I kept hidden for the sake of our peace." Tears I didn't know I was holding back began to fall, splashing onto the crisp paper. He had done this for us, for our quiet life, to shield us from the very greed that was now trying to tear me apart. The will was simple. Everything he owned, he left to me, his wife, to manage as I saw fit. But it was the document underneath, a thick one bound in blue, that held the true power, a revocable, living trust. Frank, with his accountant's sharp eye, took it from my shaking hands. He flipped through the pages of dense legal text, his breath catching every few moments. "This is incredible," he murmured. "Ashley, this trust, it details everything. He set it up years ago, but this is the part you need to see." He pointed to a specific article. Article 4, Section B. His finger traced the words as he read them aloud, his voice full of awe for his departed friend's foresight. "The primary inheritance designated for my son, Christopher Hayes, shall be distributed upon my wife's passing, conditional upon the following: that he has demonstrated to the sole satisfaction of the executor, Ashley Hayes, a consistent pattern of love, honor, and respect toward his mother. The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. Love, honor, and respect. My son, who had ripped a cherished gift from my wrist. My son, who was at this very moment plotting to have me declared mentally unfit. David had seen it. He had seen the seeds of this betrayal long before they had bloomed, and from beyond the grave, he had given me a shield. He had given me a sword. I closed the box, the phantom weight of the Rolex on my son's wrist now replaced by the immense weight of this new reality. "Frank," I said, my voice steady for the first time in weeks, the tears gone, replaced by something cold and hard. "I need you to recommend the most ruthless probate lawyer you know." Walking into Miss Albright's corner office, with its panoramic view of the city, I felt for the first time not like a widow under attack, but like a queen preparing for battle. Frank had made the call the night before, and the appointment was set for 10 o'clock sharp. The office was on the 42nd floor of a glass skyscraper, a world away from my quiet, tree-lined street. The desk was a vast expanse of polished mahogany. The chairs were supple black leather, and the air itself seemed to hum with quiet, expensive power. Ms. Albright was a woman in her 50s, with sharp, intelligent eyes, an immaculate gray suit, and a handshake that was both firm and reassuring. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Frank told me the basics, Mrs. Hayes," she said, her voice calm and direct. "But I want to hear it from you. Start from the beginning." With Frank by my side, I recounted the entire sordid tale. I spoke of the Thanksgiving humiliation, the unannounced appraiser, the threatening letter, and finally, the contents of David's secret file box. I slid the blue-bound trust document across the polished desk. Ms. Albright read through the key sections, her expression shifting from professional interest to a focused, predatory intensity. She paused at the love, honor, and respect clause, reading it twice. She leaned back in her chair, a slow, sharp smile playing on her lips. "Your husband was a very smart man, Mrs. Hayes, and a very loving one." She then looked at the legal letter from my son's lawyer. "So, they think you're a confused old woman living on a fixed income." Her smile widened. "Excellent. The best weapon in a fight is an opponent who completely underestimates you." Her confidence was a balm to my frayed nerves. For the first time, I felt like I was not alone in this fight. I had a general. "They've sent a letter threatening a petition for a conservatorship hearing," she continued, her tone all business now. "They'll bring witnesses, probably paid experts, to testify that you're mentally declining. Their goal is to have the court declare you incompetent and appoint Christopher as your legal guardian, giving him full control." "Can they win?" I asked, the fear still a cold stone in my stomach. Ms. Albright's eyes flashed with a fire that was both terrifying and wonderful. "They could, if you were the person they think you are, but you are not." She tapped the trust document. "This changes everything. We are not going to respond to their letter. We are not going to warn them. We are going to let them walk with all their arrogance right into open court." The strategy was audacious, and it sent a thrill through me. "We let them build their entire case on the lie that you are a vulnerable, impoverished widow," she explained. "We let them perjure themselves on the stand. We let them dig their own graves, and then at the very end, we present the truth. Not just as a defense, but as an execution." The word hung in the air, cold and final. This wasn't just about protecting my assets anymore. This was about justice. "We're not just going to defend Mrs. Hayes," Miss Albright said, her voice dropping to a low, determined pitch. "We are going to dismantle them." "First step," she said, picking up her phone and buzzing her assistant. "Sarah, get a court order for me immediately. We're going to subpoena the complete financial records for Christopher and Jessica Hayes. Every credit card statement, every loan application, every bank account. Let's see just how deep this desperation goes. The thick manila envelope that arrived from Ms. Albright's office contained more than just bank statements. It contained the anatomy of my son's moral decay. It was delivered by a courier late on a Thursday afternoon, and I waited until nightfall to open it. I sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I had helped Christopher with his second-grade math homework, and spread the contents under the small, focused circle of a single lamp. Page after page told a story of reckless illusion. The stark black and white of the financial records was colder than any legal threat. I saw credit card statements from high-end boutiques, handbags costing thousands, shoes I couldn't imagine. I saw the loan application for a luxury SUV they couldn't possibly afford, followed by a series of sharp red-stamped delinquency notices. The phone call from weeks ago, where I'd heard Jessica demanding the full amount, now seemed like a grotesque understatement. The full amount wasn't for a late bill, it was to finance a fantasy. It was a damning picture of a life lived on borrowed time and borrowed money. There were cash advances, late fees, and threatening letters from creditors. They were not just overspending, they were drowning. The final summary sheet prepared by Ms. Albright's office put their total consumer debt at over $120,000. Seeing the number in black and white was the final devastating blow. This confirmed their motivation was pure, desperate greed. The anger I had felt before was replaced by a hollow, aching sadness. This wasn't just a lapse in judgment, it was a profound failure of character. This was my son, the boy I had taught the value of a dollar earned and a debt paid, living a life built on lies. He had sold his integrity for a lifestyle he couldn't afford. With a heavy heart, I picked up the phone and dialed Ms. Albright, even though it was past 9 o'clock. She answered on the second ring. "It's worse than I thought," I said, my voice quiet. There was no surprise in her tone, only a calm, tactical certainty. "I know, Mrs. Hayes. I've been reviewing my copy." She paused, then her voice hardened with purpose. "And now we have everything we need. They're not just disrespectful, Mrs. Hayes. They're desperate. And that makes them predictable." Her words cut through my sadness and reminded me of the fight ahead. This wasn't just a family tragedy, it was a legal battle, and their desperation was the motive we needed to prove their case was a sham. I saw it all clearly now. Their panic was the fuel for their cruelty. My home wasn't just a nice-to-have, it was their only lifeline. The thought sent a chill through me, but it was a chill of clarity, not fear. The stage was set. I was now fully armed with legal power, emotional truth, and irrefutable proof of motive. "I'll see you in court on Tuesday," Ms. Albright said, her voice firm, pulling me back to the present. "Wear something that makes you feel strong, and let him think he's winning, right up until the very end." The courtroom was colder than I remembered, a sterile, impersonal space where my son was about to publicly dismantle the memory of the mother who raised him. I sat straight in the polished wooden bench, Ms. Albright at my side, her quiet confidence a small island in my sea of nerves. I wore a simple navy blue dress, the one I had chosen because it made me feel strong. Across the aisle, Christopher sat next to Jessica, his gaze fixed on his hands. Jessica, however, looked perfectly composed in a severe black dress, a single strand of pearls at her throat, the very picture of a concerned, grieving daughter-in-law. My sister Diana and Frank were in the row behind me, their presence a silent, unwavering wall of support. Christopher's lawyer, a man named Mr. Davies with an arrogant posture and a condescending smile, began his opening statement. "Your Honor," he said, his voice dripping with false solemnity. "We are here today for a painful but necessary reason, to protect a beloved but tragically confused matriarch from herself." He gestured toward me without ever making eye contact. "Mrs. Ashley Hayes, since the passing of her husband 5 years ago, has shown a clear and accelerating mental decline. This petition for conservatorship is not an act of greed. It is an act of love." Every word was a carefully polished lie, designed to strip me of my dignity. My hands clenched in my lap, but I kept my face a mask of calm neutrality, just as Ms. Albright had instructed. The petitioner calls Mr. Christopher Hayes to the stand. My son walked to the witness box, his steps rehearsed. And then I saw it. I saw the Rolex on Christopher's wrist as he raised his hand to be sworn in, gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. The watch David gave me, the sheer brazen audacity of it stole my breath. Mr. Davies led him through a litany of fabrications. Christopher recounted stories of my supposed forgetfulness, a forgotten appointment here, misplaced keys there. He spoke of my increasing paranoia, mentioning my unfounded suspicions about his finances and the hiring of Miss Albright as proof I was being manipulated by outsiders. He told a detailed, invented story about me accusing a delivery driver of stealing a package that had simply been left on the back porch. His voice was filled with a practiced, gentle sadness that made my stomach turn. "And now, Mr. Hayes," Davies said, his tone softening, "I want to take you back to this past Thanksgiving, a difficult day for everyone, I imagine." "It was terrible," Christopher said, his voice cracking on cue. "My mother, she wasn't herself. She became hysterical when we simply tried to talk to her about planning for her future. Yelling, making wild accusations. We were so worried she was going to hurt herself." He looked at the judge, his eyes pleading. "She was wearing my father's watch, a priceless family heirloom. In her state, I was afraid she would lose it or damage it. So I had to secure it for its own protection. It was the only thing I could think to do to calm her down." A murmur went through the courtroom. I could feel the gazes of pity on me. I had been recast as the unstable, hysterical old woman, and he, the responsible, long-suffering son. Mr. Davies walked back to his table, then turned for his final question. "Mr. Hayes, why are you putting yourself and your mother through this difficult process?" Christopher looked directly at the judge, his eyes welling with crocodile tears. "I love my mother," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "That's why I'm here, to protect her from herself." The judge looked over at me with an expression of genuine pity, and in that moment I saw Jessica flash a small, triumphant smile at her husband. They thought they had already won. "The petitioner rests, Your Honor," Mr. Davies said, returning to his seat with a self-satisfied air. A heavy silence settled over the courtroom. I felt the weight of every pitying stare, every whispered judgment. They believed him. They believed my son. Then Ms. Albright's calm, clear voice cut through the stillness. "The defense calls Mrs. Ashley Hayes to the stand." My heart hammered against my ribs, but my legs were steady as I rose. As I walked past the petitioner's table, I did not look at my son. I looked at the watch on his wrist. It was a piece of my husband, a piece of my life, worn as a prop in his elaborate lie. The sight of it didn't fuel my anger. It focused it into a single, sharp point of resolve. I sat in the witness box, the wood cool and solid beneath my trembling hands. I swore the oath, my voice unwavering. Miss Albright began, her questions simple and direct, each one a careful brick laid in the foundation of the truth. "Mrs. Hayes, your son testified that you have become increasingly forgetful. He mentioned you forgot a dentist appointment on October 15th. Can you tell the court where you were on that day?" "I was in Hartford, Connecticut, visiting my sister, Diana," I said calmly. "We spent the afternoon at the Wadsworth Atheneum Museum of Art. My sister is in the gallery today and can confirm." I glanced back at Diana, who nodded firmly at the judge. "He also mentioned an incident where you supposedly left the gas stove on. Has that ever happened?" "No," I replied. "I am meticulous about the stove. My husband David once did that 20 years ago, and the fright it gave us was something I never forgot. One by one, with quiet dignity, I dismantled their flimsy stories. I was not a confused old woman. I was a woman whose life was being deliberately misrepresented. The judge, who had initially looked at me with a weary sort of pity, was now leaning forward, his attention fully captured. "Now, Mrs. Hayes," Ms. Albright said, her voice softening slightly, "I want to take you back to Thanksgiving. Your son described you as hysterical. Is that how you would describe your state of mind?" "No," I said. "I would describe it as heartbroken." I looked at the judge, speaking to him as if we were the only two people in the room. My son and his wife told me they wanted me to sell my home, the home my husband and I built together. When I refused, my son... He stood up, walked over to me, and he took my husband's watch from my wrist. My voice broke just for a second on the word took. He told me I didn't deserve it. Miss Albright let the words hang in the air. "He took the watch you were wearing." "Yes, the Rolex. It was the last gift my husband ever gave me." She turned to the judge. "Your Honor, Mr. Hayes testified that he secured a valuable family heirloom for its own protection. I would now like to have that heirloom, the Rolex watch currently worn by Mr. Hayes, entered as evidence." A jolt went through the courtroom. Christopher's lawyer, Mr. Davies, shot to his feet. "Objection! Relevance?" "It is the entire basis of my client's emotional state, which you yourself have put on trial," Ms. Albright countered smoothly. "Overruled," the judge said, his eyes fixed on Christopher. "Mr. Hayes, please give the watch to the bailiff." Christopher went pale. His hands fumbled at his wrist, his earlier confidence completely gone. He looked at Jessica, whose own smug expression had been wiped clean off her face. He unclasped the watch and handed it over as if it were burning his skin. The bailiff walked the Rolex up to the judge's bench. "Your Honor," Ms. Albright said, her voice ringing with a quiet authority, "my client's son claimed he took this to protect it. Perhaps you could read the inscription on the back, engraved by his late father, into the record." The judge picked up the heavy gold watch. The courtroom was so silent I could hear the faint rustle of paper from the court reporter's desk. He turned it over, squinting at the back. He was silent for a long, charged moment. Then he cleared his throat and read aloud into the microphone. His voice slow and deliberate. "To my beloved wife, you carried me through everything." A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. Christopher sank in his chair, his face the color of ash. The judge slowly lowered the watch, his gaze lifting to look directly at my son. His expression was no longer one of pity. It was one of cold, hard judgment. The echo of my husband's words still hung in the air when Ms. Albright said, "Your Honor, that inscription is not just a testament to love. It is the entire basis for Mr. David Hayes's final wishes." Her voice, crisp and commanding, sliced through the stunned silence of the courtroom. Mr. Davies, Christopher's lawyer, looked utterly blindsided, his mouth slightly agape. Christopher himself seemed to shrink in his chair, the blood draining from his face, leaving behind a waxy, pale sheen. "I'd like to present the deceased's true last will and testament and the associated trust documents," Ms. Albright announced. She walked back to our table and retrieved the heavy blue-bound folder from the file box David had left behind. The click of her heels on the marble floor was the only sound. She placed the certified documents before the judge. "Your Honor, the petitioner's entire case is built on the premise that my client, Mrs. Hayes, is an impoverished widow unable to manage her affairs. This is a fiction. The truth is, Mr. David Hayes was a discreet but exceptionally successful investor, leaving behind commercial properties, a diversified stock portfolio, and liquid assets totaling in the 8 figures. A collective murmur swept through the courtroom. I saw Jessica lean forward, her eyes wide, no longer with concern, but with a frantic, hungry light. Her lawyer put a hand on her arm, but she shook it off. "This trust," Ms. Albright continued, her voice resonating with power. "Leaves all assets under the sole control and executorship of his wife, Ashley Hayes." She then turned a page, her finger landing on a specific paragraph. But the most critical part is Article 4, Section B, the conduct clause pertaining to the inheritance of his son, Christopher Hayes. With your permission, I'd like to read it. The judge nodded, his gaze now a laser fixed on the document. Ms. Albright's voice was clear and deliberate, letting each word land like a hammer blow. The inheritance designated for Christopher Hayes is conditional. It shall only be granted if he has demonstrated, to the sole satisfaction of the executor, a consistent pattern of love, honor, and respect toward his mother. She paused, letting the three words hang in the dead air. Love, honor, respect. The very things Christopher had methodically destroyed. I saw his shoulders slump in utter defeat. Ms. Albright was not finished. She turned, gesturing to the stack of subpoenaed records on our table. "Your Honor, the petitioner claims this action is born of love. We have here financial records showing that Mr. and Mrs. Hayes are in over $120,000 of debt, providing a clear financial motive for their actions. Is that love?" She held up their own legal filing. "They came into this court and testified under oath that my client is mentally incompetent, paranoid, and hysterical in an attempt to strip her of her home and her autonomy. Is that honor?" She finally gestured toward the Rolex, still sitting on the judge's bench, and they physically ripped that watch, a symbol of her husband's devotion, from her wrist, telling her she didn't deserve it. Your Honor, does any of this look like the actions of a son showing love, honor, and respect? She rested her case, her final question echoing in the profound silence. She had not just presented a defense, she delivered a devastating, evidence-backed indictment, leaving Christopher and his lawyer with absolutely no rebuttal. The judge looked from the mountain of evidence to Christopher, his face a mask of utter contempt. He slowly removed his reading glasses. "Mr. Davies," he said to the opposing lawyer, his voice dangerously low, "do you have anything left to say, or have you had enough?" Mr. Davies stood frozen for a long moment, his mouth opening and closing with no sound coming out. Finally, he managed a weak, defeated whisper. "We have nothing further, Your Honor." The judge's gavel came down not with a crack, but with the dead thud of a coffin lid closing on my son's future. "This court finds the petition for conservatorship to be not only baseless, but predatory," the judge stated, his voice ringing with cold authority. He removed his glasses and fixed his gaze on Christopher, who looked like a hollowed-out version of my son. "Mr. Hayes, you came into this court under the guise of filial love, but the evidence shows your motives were rooted in pure, desperate greed. You attempted to use the legal system as a weapon to strip your own mother of her home, her assets, and her dignity." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "Your father, in his wisdom, protected your mother from the one thing he feared most, your own greed. He put a test in his trust, a simple test of character, a test of love, honor, and respect. You have failed that test in the most spectacular and deplorable fashion I have seen in my 20 years on this bench." I looked at Christopher, who was staring at the floor, a broken man. Beside him, Jessica made a strangled sound of pure panic. "Therefore," the judge continued, his voice leaving no room for appeal, "the petition for conservatorship is dismissed with extreme prejudice. The court also rules that Christopher Hayes has unequivocally violated the terms of the David Hayes Trust, and as such, forfeits any and all claims to its inheritance, now and in the future." He wasn't finished. Furthermore, given the frivolous and malicious nature of this lawsuit, you, Mr. Hayes, and your wife, Mrs. Hayes, are hereby ordered to reimburse Mrs. Ashley Hayes for her entire legal fees. The doors to the courtroom opened and the spell was broken. Reporters scribbled furiously. Frank and my sister hugged me, their faces a mixture of relief and sorrow. I felt a quiet, solemn sense of finality. It was a victory, but a victory that cost me my son. As we filed out into the bustling courthouse hallway, the tension between Christopher and Jessica finally exploded. "You idiot!" Jessica shrieked, turning on him with a face contorted by fury. People in the hallway stopped to stare. "You lost us millions. This was all your fault. You were too weak." "My fault?" Christopher shot back, his voice cracking. "You were the one who pushed for this. You were the one who brought in the lawyer. Because you were supposed to be convincing," she screamed, jabbing a finger at his chest. "You were supposed to be the grieving, loving son, but you couldn't even lie convincingly. I can't believe I married such an incompetent fool." The raw venom in her voice was startling. Her accusations echoed in the marble hallway, a public spectacle of their collapsed fantasy. I watched them, two people consumed by the greed that had brought them together, now being torn apart by it. I turned and walked away, Frank's steady hand on my arm, not feeling triumphant, but simply free. 6 months later, I stood on the balcony of a hotel in Florence, Italy, and for the first time in years, the only weight on my wrist was a simple leather-banded watch I'd bought for myself. It was June of 2026, and the Tuscan sun felt like a benediction on my face. The heavy gold Rolex that had started it all was now safe in a bank vault back in Princeton, its purpose fulfilled. It was no longer a weapon of war, but what David had always intended it to be, a memory of love. I held the small, simple watch on my wrist now, a stark contrast to the burden I had carried. This one didn't measure the time I'd lost. It measured the time I had left, time that was entirely my own. Using the resources David had so carefully hidden from me, I was finally seeing the world he had written about in his old travel journals. I walked through the Uffizi Gallery, stood beneath the dome of the Duomo, and ate gelato by the Arno River. With every step, I felt the ghost of the frightened, besieged woman I had been fading away, replaced by someone stronger, someone who was finally at peace. When I returned to Princeton in the fall, the house was no longer a battleground. It was my sanctuary again. I had the walls painted a warm cream, sold the formal dining set that held such bitter memories, and turned David's office into a bright, airy studio for myself. The silence was no longer heavy with accusation. It was filled with the soft scratch of my charcoal on paper and the music of an old jazz station. I had also started the foundation. The David Hayes Foundation for Elder Justice now occupied a small rented office downtown, with Ms. Albright serving on the board and Frank volunteering as our financial consultant. We'd already taken on our first 2 cases, helping elderly parents navigate legal abuse from their own children. My pain had found its purpose. Then, one crisp October morning, a letter arrived. It was a simple, plain envelope with my name and address written in Christopher's familiar, now hesitant handwriting. There was no return address. For a long time, I just held it, the paper feeling impossibly heavy. Finally, I sat in my sunlit studio and opened it. The letter was short, just a few paragraphs on a single sheet of notebook paper. "Mom," it began, "I don't know if you'll even read this. I don't deserve for you to. There's no excuse for what I did. I was a coward and a fool, and I let greed and Jessica's ambition turn me into a monster. I am ashamed of the man I was in that courtroom. I am ashamed that I hurt you. I am sorry. Jessica and I have separated. The money is gone and so is she. I'm working 2 jobs now, trying to pay back what the court ordered and start over. I am trying to learn how to be a man my father would not be ashamed of. I am not asking for your forgiveness because I haven't earned it. I just wanted you to know that I am sorry." Tears pricked my eyes as I read, but they were not tears of reconciliation. They were tears of quiet, sad finality. It was the apology I had needed to hear, but hearing it didn't magically mend the chasm between us. The son I had loved was gone, and this stranger, this broken man, was all that was left. I placed the letter in a drawer. Maybe someday we would speak again. Maybe not. But for the first time, my future didn't depend on his choices. It was entirely my own. Placing my son's letter into the drawer felt like closing a book on a long, painful chapter of my life. I've learned that setting boundaries isn't selfish. It's a necessary act of self-love. And that true family is built on honor, not on what can be taken from you. My victory wasn't in the courtroom or in the bank statements, but in the quiet moment, I realized my own dignity never had a price tag. The morning coffee in my peaceful, silent home has never tasted so much like freedom. I would love to connect with you in the comments. Have you ever had to turn a painful experience into your greatest source of strength?